Welcome to Break and Build. I am Muniba Mazari. This is my new public motivation channel, and this isn't just another channel. Let's talk about something that most people miss when analyzing global power. You see, in the modern geopolitical landscape, power is often mistaken for noise. Nations clamor for attention, shout their intentions into microphones, and wear their aggression on their sleeves. The louder a country is, the more serious it's perceived to be. But there's a deeper psychological truth at play here, something that cuts to the core of human nature itself. And that truth is this: the most powerful force in a room is often the one that doesn't need to speak. Silence, when deliberate, when rooted in awareness and strength, becomes a weapon far more disarming than threats. This is precisely what we witnessed in Jaishankar's recent handling of the West, particularly the United States. While diplomats from Washington hurled subtle accusations and crafted narratives aimed at cornering India into submission over trade, over Ukraine, over alignment, Jaishankar did not fall into the emotional trap. He didn't rush to retaliate rhetorically. He didn't allow himself to be dragged into a game of narratives. Instead, he did something far more psychologically effective. He waited. He responded not with rage but with reason, not with volume but with precision. Now, if we take a moment to reflect on this behavior from a philosophical lens, particularly one rooted in Stoic or even Dharmic traditions, we see a familiar pattern. The wise man, the grounded individual, the sovereign mind, it does not rush, it does not react impulsively. It remains composed because it recognizes that emotional outbursts are offerings of control. To be provoked is to surrender power. And Jaishankar, as a statesman, seems to understand this deeply. What he's doing is not just political strategy, it's psychological warfare of the highest order. In a world addicted to instant reaction, his restraint forces others to reveal their cards. By not playing their game, he rewrites the rules. That's where true power lies. Not in domination, but in the ability to compel others to recalibrate themselves in your presence. Think of the dynamic between predator and prey. The predator doesn't bark before it pounces. It watches, it studies, it controls the tempo. Jaishankar's strategic silence operates in the same manner. He watches the landscape evolve, economic shifts, diplomatic missteps, failed coercion attempts, and waits for the moment where a single calculated sentence will shift the entire board. And when he speaks, it lands like a thunderclap, not because it's loud, but because it carries the weight of deliberate thought. There's a principle in psychology, rooted in Jungian thought, that what is not said often carries more unconscious weight than what is said aloud. The unspoken truth, the silent refusal, the deliberate non-reaction. It disturbs the opponent more than direct confrontation. That's what unnerves the West. India, under Jaishankar's diplomatic philosophy, no longer feels the need to explain itself endlessly. It no longer plays the game of validation. It has stepped into self-authorship. And let's not forget, this silence is not passive. It is not apathy. It is not retreat. It is preparation. While others are busy narrating moral superiority, India is building alliances quietly. It is moving supplies into ports, signing regional trade pacts, developing strategic rail corridors, and engaging diplomatically with countries the West has long ignored. And it is doing so without needing to trumpet its moves from the rooftops. This restraint has ripple effect. When India remains calm under pressure, smaller nations take notice. When it doesn't overreact to Western pressure, other post-colonial nations begin to ask themselves, if India can do it, why can't we? This is how silence multiplies. It inspires. It decentralizes power. It allows other actors to grow. There's a deeper cultural dimension here too. In Indian philosophy, particularly in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna tells Arjuna that true strength lies in controlling the self, in acting without attachment to outcomes, in choosing response over reaction. That is exactly what we're seeing play out. India is no longer reacting to the whims of external forces. It is responding from its center, from conviction. And when a civilization begins to do that, it becomes unstoppable. Not through violence or coercion, but through presence, through clarity, through a grounded stillness that no empire can shake. So when Jaishankar sits across the table from Western leaders and listens calmly, assertively, without rushing to prove or defend, he is not just representing a government. He is embodying a civilizational shift. He is showing us that silence, when aligned with clarity of purpose, can silence empires that were built on noise. And here's what I want you to remember in your life, in your work, in your relationships. Don't underestimate the power of strategic silence. Don't rush to speak just to fill the void. Let your silence carry meaning. Let it be rooted in self-knowledge. Because in the end, those who can sit still while the world demands a reaction, those are the ones who shape the future. Let the world roar, but you, be deliberate, be calm, be immovable. There's a moment in every empire's life cycle when its greatest challenge is not an external enemy, but the loss of its own self-image. The United States today finds itself at such a crossroads. It is no longer feared in the same way it once was. And more importantly, it is no longer obeyed with the same automatic deference. For decades, the West, led by the US, operated on a psychological script. We define the rules, and the rest of the world falls in line. That script worked well in a post-World War order, in a bipolar Cold War reality, and even in the unipolar moment after the Soviet Union collapsed. But something subtle and deeply significant is happening now. The script is failing, and nations like India are no longer playing the role they were assigned. Jaishankar's quiet resistance to American pressure is more than diplomacy. It's a mirror being held up to a declining superpower. It's an act of psychological clarity. Because what he's essentially saying is, we no longer believe in your monopoly on truth, and we no longer fear the consequences of saying so. This moment matters not just geopolitically, but existentially, because it reveals something that few in power want to admit, that American dominance was always partially held together by illusion, by the belief, deeply internalized by both allies and adversaries, that the US was the final authority, the moral judge, the economic gatekeeper, the strategic backbone of the so-called free world. But belief, as any psychologist will tell you, is fragile. When exposed to enough contradiction, when repeatedly shown that the judge is compromised or the gatekeeper is selective, the belief begins to erode. And once it erodes, what remains is a hollow structure, impressive in memory but vulnerable in reality. India's refusal to comply with American expectations on Ukraine, on trade policy, on energy partnerships with Russia. This isn't just a deviation from Western alignment. It's a withdrawal of belief in the illusion. And that withdrawal, when done with dignity and clarity, shakes the foundations of the system far more than a hostile act ever could. What Jaishankar did was intellectually brilliant and emotionally restrained. He didn't attack America. He didn't insult it. He simply told the truth, that the world has changed, that countries now act in their own interest, and that moral lectures from powers with a history of interventionism carry little weight in today's world. And the power of that truth, delivered calmly, factually, and without apology, was impossible to ignore. Now, let's look at this psychologically. The dominant power, when challenged by someone it once viewed as subordinate, experiences cognitive dissonance. It's like a parent realizing their child no longer needs their permission. There's a kind of identity crisis that emerges, not necessarily violent, but destabilizing. The US, in reacting with unease to India's independence, is revealing that its dominance was always reliant on perceived superiority, not absolute legitimacy. This is not an anti-American statement. It's an observation of what happens when any dominant system is forced to confront the autonomy of others. The more America tries to reassert control through coercion or shame, the more it exposes the fact that its control is no longer inherent. It must now be demanded, negotiated, or manufactured. And that's the tipping point. India's emergence under leaders like Jaishankar is not just about national pride. It's about psychological maturity. It's about the nation recognizing its own mind, its own values, its own strategic calculus, and acting accordingly. This is what mature individuals do, and it's what mature civilizations must eventually do as well. The parent-child dynamic no longer fits. Let's not romanticize this. India still faces monumental challenges, poverty, inequality, social discord. But what we're seeing is a shift in posture, a psychological shift from reactive to proactive, from subordinate to sovereign. And that shift unsettles those who relied on a world where India and the broader global South remain deferential. Jaishankar isn't just making speeches. He's offering a new model for how post-colonial nations can engage with power. He is saying we don't need to choose sides between old empires. We are the new axis. And the psychological power of that statement, again not shouted but calmly asserted, is immense. So what do we learn from this? We learn that real power is not found in domination, but in independence of thought. That maturity, whether personal or political, requires the courage to act without seeking approval. And that the moment you stop needing validation from those who once defined your worth, you begin to reclaim something far greater than influence. You reclaim authorship over your own story. The US has not fallen, but it has been confronted not with force, not with rebellion, but with clarity. And clarity, especially when paired with self-respect, has the quiet power to rewrite history. So here's your takeaway. Don't be afraid to disrupt the illusion. Don't be afraid to stand firm when those in power expect you to kneel. True sovereignty of a person, a nation, or a civilization begins the moment you stop asking for permission to exist. There are moments in history where the choices of small nations reveal the direction of global power far more clearly than the proclamations of superpowers. Burkina Faso may not dominate headlines in Western media, and yet its recent alignment with India over traditional Western allies marks a subtle but profound shift in the architecture of international relations. To dismiss it as an outlier would be to miss the psychological and strategic reality unfolding beneath the surface. We need to understand what compels a nation, particularly one in the global south, with a history shaped by colonial exploitation and post-independence instability, to suddenly reorient its diplomatic compass. That shift is rarely triggered by ideology alone. It emerges from something deeper: trust, a quiet but undeniable recognition of integrity, competence, and respect. And when Burkina Faso looked across the global landscape, it found in India not a savior, not a benefactor, but a partner who understood what it means to rise without arrogance. What's remarkable here is that India did not arrive in Ouagadougou with ultimatums or veiled threats. It came with clarity, with cultural empathy, and with an offer grounded in mutual interest. Infrastructure development, agricultural partnerships, digital transformation support. Yes, those were on the table. But beneath those tangible offers was something more powerful: the absence of domination, the absence of ideological coercion, the absence of the condescension that often accompanies Western aid. And that matters psychologically. Nations, like individuals, have memories, collective memories. And Burkina Faso, like many of its African neighbors, remembers the weight of foreign promises that came wrapped in chains, economic or political. So when India stepped in, not with superiority, but with sovereignty, it signaled something unprecedented: that global power need not come at the expense of dignity. Now let's look at this from a systems perspective. The old world order functioned through vertical hierarchies centered on the West, radiating outward. India, in contrast, is constructing a horizontal network, a web of strategic alignments where mutual benefit replaces unilateral control. This is not a charity model. It is not neocolonialism in new clothes. It is something fundamentally different, a model of partnership built on cultural respect and long-term vision rather than short-term profit or ideological conformity. Jaishankar, in his dealings with nations like Burkina Faso, isn't just building foreign policy. He's practicing psychological realignment. He's offering an example of leadership that doesn't threaten but inspires, that doesn't posture but invites. He sees quite clearly that the global south is no longer asking for validation from the old powers. It is looking for mirrors, nations that have walked the path of struggle, of insult, of isolation, and emerged with their spine intact. India is such a mirror. It was once dismissed, manipulated, and underestimated, but now it walks into negotiations not as a beggar of favor, but as a broker of balance. And that's what Burkina Faso responded to. Not just a better trade deal, not just economic logic, but the psychological presence of a country that refuses to be ashamed of its identity. There's something profoundly philosophical in that. Because what Burkina Faso's pivot represents is not just geopolitical strategy. It is a reclaiming of voice. When a nation that has historically been silenced or dismissed chooses to realign, it is engaging in a form of existential defiance. It's saying, we are not here to be managed. We are here to participate. And India, by respecting that desire, becomes more than a global actor. It becomes a catalyst for transformation. The speech we have explored is not merely an analysis of global politics or a tribute to a particular leader. It is a profound commentary on the psychology of power, sovereignty, and the silent revolution that is reshaping the world order. At its core lies a quiet but unshakable truth, that the loudest voice is not always the most influential, and that true leadership lies in precision, restraint, and unyielding clarity. Dr. S. Jaishankar's diplomatic strategy is more than a political maneuver. It is an embodiment of a philosophical doctrine deeply embedded in Indian civilization, a doctrine that teaches us the strength of stillness and the authority of calm defiance. It is through his composure in the face of provocation and his refusal to participate in theatrical diplomacy that India sends a message more powerful than any speech, a message that echoes the principles of ancient wisdom and projects them into the modern global arena. By resisting the urge to retaliate rhetorically or to succumb to reactionary politics, Jaishankar has shifted the framework of global diplomacy. He has moved the needle from validation, seeking to value-anchored engagement. When a nation as historically complex and diverse as India ceases to plead its case and instead begins to assert its presence through silence, strategy, and sincerity, the world takes notice. This silence is not the absence of engagement. It is the elevation of diplomacy to a higher plane where every word is weighed, every sentence is crafted, and every action is rooted in long-term vision rather than short-term applause. In this space, Jaishankar's words land like thunder not because of their loudness, but because of the gravity they carry. What we are witnessing is not merely India's rise, it is the psychological maturation of a nation that has endured centuries of colonialism, exploitation, and external control. And through this endurance, it has developed an internal compass that now guides its geopolitical posture. That compass is grounded in civilizational self-awareness, strategic patience, and a moral clarity that doesn't need to be marketed or defended. It just is. And in a world that increasingly operates on curated images and hyperactive messaging, this kind of authenticity stands out. India is no longer trying to prove itself to the West. It is being itself. That act of self-authorship is what unsettles traditional powers because it exposes the fragility of systems that rely on obedience rather than respect. The US, once the uncontested leader of a post-war world, now finds itself facing a world that no longer accepts its authority as automatic. The loss of that automatic deference is not an act of hostility. It is an act of growing up. It is what happens when nations step into their own sovereignty and realize that the stage they were once allowed to occupy as supporting actors is no longer enough. They seek their own spotlight, not to imitate the West, but to offer a new vision of global interaction. India's engagement with nations like Burkina Faso is emblematic of that vision, one that is based not on control, but on mutual dignity. It's not about asserting dominance, but about rediscovering balance. That balance allows smaller nations to breathe, to reimagine themselves not as aid recipients, but as strategic partners. In that moment, they reclaim their voice, and that reclamation ripples far beyond economics or policy. It touches the collective psychology of a region and invites others to do the same. What Jaishankar has done is create space. Space for nations to reflect on their own identity without external definitions. Space for countries to reimagine diplomacy as a tool of empowerment rather than coercion. And space for the global South to see in India a model not of perfection, but of progression. A nation that has stumbled, struggled, and now stands firm not because it was given power, but because it earned it. The West may have led the last century, but leadership in the next century will not be defined by volume. It will be defined by vision, not by how much noise a nation makes, but by how deeply it listens, how wisely it acts, and how authentically it shows up on the world's stage. This moment is not about East versus West, or the fall of one power and the rise of another. It is about recalibration, about understanding that power, when rooted in respect and self-awareness, becomes a catalyst for collaboration rather than conflict. India is showing us that sovereignty is not the rejection of others, but the refusal to be defined by them. That is a psychological victory greater than any military conquest. And for the nations of the global South, that victory is deeply personal. It signals a future where influence is earned through example, not enforced through fear. Where diplomacy becomes dialogue, not dominance. And where progress is measured not by who shouts the loudest, but by who moves the deepest. Therein lies the power of Jaishankar's diplomacy. Not in flamboyance or confrontation, but in clarity. His restraint is not weakness, it is wisdom. His patience is not delay, it is depth. His silence is not avoidance, it is assertion of purpose. And in a time when the world is restless, that kind of presence is revolutionary, because it forces others to reconsider their assumptions. It demands a reevaluation of power dynamics, and it signals, without the need for slogans or declarations, that the age of unquestioned Western authority is ending, not with a bang, but with a whisper of sovereign intent. If we listen carefully, we can hear that whisper gaining strength. In Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in conversations once dictated by others, new voices are emerging. And many of those voices are echoing what India has demonstrated, that to stand tall, one need not shout. To lead, one need not dominate. To be heard, one need not obey. In this, we find not just a foreign policy doctrine, but a life principle, one that applies to nations and individuals alike. That we find our greatest strength not in noise but in knowing, not in reaction but in response, and not in imitation but in self-expression. So if you're listening to this today and wondering what lesson you can take from a geopolitical speech, let it be this: never underestimate the power of stillness. In a world that demands immediate reaction, hold your silence until your truth is ready. In a world that expects compliance, walk with self-belief. In a world that equates volume with value, speak only when your words can shift the conversation. That is what India is doing. That is what Jaishankar is modeling. And that is what the world, slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably, is beginning to understand. Because ultimately, the most transformative movements in history do not begin with noise. They begin with clarity, with presence, with the quiet confidence of those who no longer ask for permission to exist. That is the psychological revolution unfolding today, not just in the corridors of diplomacy, but in the hearts of people who are ready to reclaim their power. India is no longer knocking on the door of history. It is building a new one, and through strategic silence, disciplined diplomacy, and unwavering vision, it is inviting the world to walk through it, not as followers, but as equals. That is the future, and that future is already here.